Welcome to this video on Legal Responsibilities Part 2. My name is Scott Vaughn. I'm with Community Development Unit of Alberta Culture, Multiculturalism, and Status of Women. Before I begin, I would like to mention that the goal of our board development video series is for board members of nonprofit organizations to have the basic knowledge, skills, and tools to be successful in their work. We realize that some of you are not board members, and that's fine. But we want you to be aware that the information, concepts, and ideas presented are from board member perspectives. Also, the information presented here is aimed at an introductory level or as a refresher for board members to ensure they have the base level understanding of board governance concepts and principles needed to successfully do their work. We do have other resources that we can share with you, such as our toolkit. There is a link in the description of this video to our toolkit that provides additional resources and links we think are helpful for you and your nonprofit organization as you tackle your governance issues. Included in this toolkit is a copy of the slides we use in this video and all the videos in our board development video series. You can also hit the subscribe button down below and turn the notification on to subscribe to your YouTube channel and get notification about upcoming videos. The last thing I want to mention before we get going is that in this video, we are not providing advice. The information offered in this video and the related materials are not intended to constitute legal advice in any way, the rendering of legal concepts, consulting, or other professional services of any kind. We simply want to share with you information that we think will be helpful for board members as you navigate your organization through its governance and operations. The objectives of the video. By the end of this video, you'll be able to hopefully describe the duty of loyalty and how conflict of interest is associated with it. Explain what conflict of interest is and why it's important for nonprofits to identify and manage conflict of interest. And describe how board members can manage and deal with conflict of interest in nonprofit organizations. So let's get going. I'll be speaking about the duty of loyalty and its strongly associated example, conflict of interest. But first, let's take a moment to go over the sources of duty and responsibilities, and as well as fiduciary duty. Written law and common law are legal responsibilities, or things an organization must follow. There are also best practices and voluntary responsibilities, which are things that the organization can choose to do. When exploring duty of loyalty and its associated conflict of interest, we'll be looking at common law and how it's connected to the legal responsibilities of a board. Common law refers to the laws that change as new decisions are made by judges in court. Whenever a judge makes a decision in court, that decision is legally enforced. From that point on, that decision becomes a precedent or a rule that will guide judges who make future decisions in similar cases. Common law is unique because it cannot be found in any code or legislation. It exists only in past decisions. This fact also makes it flexible and adaptable to changing circumstances. When common law decisions are made in courts, judges will consider fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty is really about whether or not people can be trusted in the positions that they have. In the case of nonprofit boards, this trust is applied primarily to board members. Why is it applied primarily to board members? Because the board is the highest level of decision-making in the organization. The board has the authority and the responsibility to make decisions for the organization. In part one of Legal Responsibilities video, the focus was on fiduciary duties, duty of care. In this video, I will discuss the other fiduciary branch, duty of loyalty. The duty of loyalty requires that a board member act honestly and in good faith in the best interest of the organization. This means, among other things, that a board member is not allowed to profit from their office and must avoid all situations in which their duty to the organization conflicts with their interest or their loyalty to others and other organizations. Let's explore this further. How can the director fulfill the duty of loyalty? Act in the best interest of the organization and not their own interest. For example, if a board member of a not-for-profit community organization owns a private company, a private painting company, this is his or her day job, that is being considered for a painting project that the not-for-profit organization is accepting bids for, the board member needs to immediately declare the personal conflict and remove his or herself from any related discussions, decisions that the board makes related to the matter. Also, avoid situations in which they have competing fiduciary duties. For example, if a board member of a not-for-profit organization that receives funding from ABC Funding Group, for example, a funding provider to not-for-profit groups, all of a sudden that same board member becomes a board member of the ABC Funding Group as well, that determine who should receive funding and does the allocation of the funding, that person now has competing fiduciary duties and will need to certainly at least remove his or herself related to any discussions or decisions the ABC Funding Group makes to his or her original group that receives that funding and that also he or she is a board member of. But even further, that person may have to decide to step down altogether as a board member from one of the groups because all funding decisions made by ABC Funding Group may affect his or her original group. So there's two types of conflict of interest, as you can see in the examples. Personal conflict between the duty to act in the best interest of the organization and your own self-interest, and a conflict of duties that the director owes to the organization they serve and to another organization. So how can a director, again, another point to look at, fulfilling the duty of loyalty? Be familiar with the organization's conflict of interest policy. Also, manage actual conflict of interest and the appearance of the conflict for self or other organization by immediately declaring any conflict of interest and following the process and requirements of the policy. There is a lot of information around conflict of interest in your toolkit, and so we certainly recommend taking a look at that. Just to solidify our understanding of conflict of interest, we're going to walk through a case study. Alberta's Chronicle has learned that the board of the Tansna Foundation for Low-Income Housing recently awarded a $25,000 contract to one of its own board members, Jay Boswell. The $25,000 came in the form of a grant from the Federal Department of Housing and was earmarked for the development of a database for the nonprofit organization. Board Chair John Brown Livingston told the Chronicle Jay Boswell was the most qualified person for the job. Executive Director Mary Lamson refused to comment on the issue. The Federal Department of Housing is now looking into the matter. So the first question is, what is the conflict here? So obviously, the $25,000 contract awarded to Jay Boswell, one of the board members of the Tansna Foundation for Low-Income Housing, is the source of the conflict. Jay Boswell personally receiving the grant is where the problem is emerging. Also further, the executive director refused to comment, and the Federal Department of Housing looking into the matter is further raising concern that the conflict of interest situation is valid, is real, is legitimate. Therefore, is something that needs to be addressed or at least further investigated. The second question is, what are the possible consequences for the board, individual board members, and the organization going forward as a result of this conflict? The answer to this question, we're going to approach first by exploring conflict of interest in more detail in the upcoming slides. So what is conflict of interest? So let's begin by defining what it is. Researching conflict of interest, you'll find many definitions containing many similar elements. For our purposes, conflict of interest is defined a situation in which a person has a private or personal interest sufficient to appear to influence the objective exercise of his or her official duties as, say, a public official, an employee, or a professional. Let's think back to fiduciary duty and the branch of the duty of loyalty. To fulfill these duties, one must proactively recognize, manage, and deal with situations of conflict of interest. It is helpful to recognize that conflict of interest are to be expected, not to fear. Furthermore, a conflict of interest is a situation, not an accusation, and being in a conflict of interest is not the same as being corrupt. As we shared before, the fiduciary duty, the duty of care, the duty of loyalty branches as well, means, among other things, that board members are expected to put the interest of the organization above their own personal and private interests. In other words, as a board member, you have a legal responsibility to act in the best interest of your not-for-profit organization when you're carrying out board work. Example, when making decisions, hiring staff, voting, making policies, etc. A conflict of interest situation happens when other interests conflict or appear to conflict with your responsibility to your organization. Having personal or private interests are not inherently wrong or bad, but whatever those other interests may affect your decision or decisions as a board member, you need to declare, discuss, deal with, and also document them with the board immediately. More about this later. Let's start by looking at why conflicts arise in the first place. Board members have an important role in the life of a nonprofit organization, and they must always act in the best interest of the organization. Board members are often recruited because of their numerous family, community, and other business relationships. They are valued because of these community, social, and business connections that can benefit the organization in a number of legitimate ways. These relationships are often important factors in the establishment and growth of the nonprofit organization. And it's important to remember these relations can also sometimes give rise to conflicts of interest. So remember that conflict of interests are to be expected, not to fear. And again, furthermore, a conflict of interest is a situation, not an accusation, and being in a conflict of interest is not the same as being corrupt. But if not proactively managed beforehand and dealt with when it arises, there are consequences. Why is understanding and dealing with conflict of interest so important? It's a matter of trust. When members of a nonprofit organization elect board members, they are placing their trust in them. They trust that the board members will represent the best interest of the organization and put aside their own personal and private interest. This includes managing the funding that the organization receives from public organizations and private donations. As a result, the public expects that nonprofit board members act honestly, with integrity, and with objective judgment. Trust is therefore what underpins everything. It is essential for relationships between members and board members. And what does conflict of interest do? It corrodes that trust on multiple levels, both within the organization and also externally in the community. Factors that compromise that the objective judgment of board members can erode the trust and cause serious risks to the organization. These risks may affect the ability of the nonprofit organization to raise funds, attract members and volunteers, and sustain public support for its mission. It can also lead to legal issues. Therefore, it is critical that nonprofit board members protect the trust of the public by avoiding conflicts of interest and reacting as soon as a conflict of interest situations arise. Therefore, dealing with and managing conflict of interest must be a priority for boards. Let's explore this a little bit more. How to manage conflict of interest. There are 4 steps, the 4 Ds. The first step is to declare or disclose the conflict. It is usually the responsibility of the individual to determine whether or not they may be in a conflict of interest situation. However, sometimes other board members may point out that one of their colleagues has a conflict. Regardless, the conflict of interest must be declared or disclosed. The second step is for the board to discuss the situation. The third step is for the board to decide how to deal with the conflict of interest appropriately. The fourth and final step of this process is to document what has been done. This can be done by recording it in meeting minutes, for example. These four steps are called the 4Ds, and they are a tool to assist boards in managing conflict of interest situations. Now let's explore the third step a little more. Deal with it. As you can see, there are a number of branches coming out on the slide that relate to deal with it. These are the 6 R's that are options to deal with it. You don't need to implement all 6 strategies, but usually it might be only one or two of a combination of them. The first strategy to help manage a conflict of interest situation is to record or register the disclosure of a conflict of interest. This first step is necessary, but it is not enough. Just recording a conflict of interest will not resolve it. It will also be necessary to assess the situation and decide what additional strategies are needed in order to resolve the conflict of interest. Another strategy is to restrict the involvement of the affected board member in the matter when necessary. For example, you may ask that board member to not get involved in the discussions about a specific issue. You can ask them not to vote and may even restrict their access to the information related to the issue. While this is a good strategy, it might not be enough. If, for example, the situation occurs frequently, the board may need to take further steps. If it is not practical to restrict the board member's involvement, an independent third party such as a lawyer or governance expert may be recruited to participate in the decision-making process, oversee it, or review at least its integrity. The fourth strategy is removing the board member from their position. If the restriction or recruitment strategies do not work or they're not feasible, the board can remove the affected board member from their position to minimize their involvement in the matter. Sometimes, the best strategy to deal with a conflict of interest is to relinquish or give up the personal or private interests. For example, the board member can sell the stocks or shares in a particular company or give up a club or association membership that is the source of the conflict. This may be a valid strategy to ensure there is no conflict of interest with the public duty of the board member. Lastly, if the conflict of interest cannot be resolved in any other way, resignation from the board may be the best option. This scenario is more likely if the board cannot relinquish or give up their private interests. So far, I've discussed the strategies to deal with the conflict of interest when it happens. However, it is important to remember that effectively managing conflict of interest situations beforehand is much easier than dealing with them after they happen. The way for nonprofits to manage conflicts of interest before they arise is to create a conflict of interest policy and to promote a conflict of interest ready organizational culture. So first of all, let's look at good policies. A conflict of interest policy provides a consistent and transparent guide for board members and staff to effectively manage conflicts of interest. The policy also shows the members, staff, stakeholders, and funders of the organization that the organization is serious about managing conflict of interest, and it has a plan on how to do so. This also speaks to the credibility of the organization in maintaining the highest standards of integrity and reputation. We have an example of a conflict of interest policy in your toolkit. Generally, a conflict of interest policy includes an overall statement of scope. This statement shows who the policy applies to. This can also include board members, volunteers, staff, and contractors. The policy should also include a definition of conflict of interest. It may be helpful to have some examples of what conflict of interest may look like in your organization. It is also recommended that the policy outlines the procedures that the organization needs to follow in order to avoid and deal with conflict of interest. It is important to remember that organizations need to regularly review policies and keep them up to date. So it's a good idea to include the date that the policy was approved and when it is due for review. Another strategy, a conflict of interest disclosure form, is a document that all board members and staff complete, and it's usually done annually. With this document, the board members and staff can declare and record any personal or private interest they have and may be in conflict with the interest of the organization. Having a written record of these interests can ensure that everyone remembers these conflict of interest, and if and when they arise, the board can deal with them appropriately. Many organizations have policies on paper, but they may not always follow them. But board members are also stewards of the organization, and they should provide oversight to the activities of the organization. Therefore, they have a key responsibility to ensure that conflict of interest policies are up to date, are well known, and are properly implemented when conflict of interest situations arise. Now moving into an organizational culture of ethical behavior. While having clear and written policies and procedures are important, policy does have its limitations. Dr. Chris McDonald, a Canadian ethics consultant, says a policy is just a paper until interpreted and implemented by organizational culture. Policy cannot guarantee the successful resolution of conflict of interest unless the organization also emphasizes ethical behavior that promotes integrity. The promotion of integrity can help reduce the chances of misbehavior among the members of the organization. Fostering an organizational culture that emphasizes ethical behavior can cut down on misbehavior in organizations. Leaders with moral compasses can set the tone when it comes to ethical dilemmas. So developing a conflict of interest ready organizational culture, or in other words, an ethical culture, can also help the boards to implement policies that I spoke about earlier. So here's a summary of some of the key legal takeaways from this session. Fiduciary duties apply to all board members. They cannot be transferred or delegated to other. Keep the interest of the organizations first. To limit liability, board members should duty of care, practice due diligence, and act as a reasonably prudent person would by demonstrating appropriate standard care. And the duty of loyalty, act honestly and in good faith in the best interest of the organization, and certainly manage conflict of interest appropriately. This brings us to the end of our video on legal responsibilities part 2. Thank you for watching. Our contact information is on the slide and they are in the toolkit as well. If you are in Alberta and you have a question, you need further information, or would like to request our services, you can contact us through email and phone. You can also access our website to know more about our resources and services. And also, if you want to be informed of future services and resources, you could add your email address to our subscription form, and you will receive information about the services and resources as they become available. The link to the subscription form is in the description of the video as well. Thank you for your attention today. Take care, stay healthy, and always remember that our communities have so much more because of everything you do. Thank you all, and bye for now.